The intake officer's name was something with 4 syllables and a click at the end that I never learned to reproduce. She looked at Hob the way people look at a piece of furniture that's been placed in an inconvenient spot. Not threatening, not interesting, just in the way. "Comfort animal," she said. It wasn't a question. She was reading it off the form I'd filed 6 weeks earlier. "That's right," I said. She looked at him again. Hob was sitting beside my left knee, which for him meant he was basically lying down. He'd given up on holding his spine fully vertical around age 9, and now his idea of sitting was a slow fold that ended with his haunches on the floor and his chest leaning into my leg. 11 years old, 74 pounds of yellow labrador, grey around the muzzle and the eyebrows. He was watching the intake officer with his amber eyes at about half-mast, which was his standard setting for everything that wasn't food or the specific rustling sound a treat bag makes. "We have a certified threat assessment wing," the intake officer said, in the tone of someone explaining a safety feature they're proud of. "All non-cavalry animals entering the facility are assessed at intake. Standard procedure." "Fine," I said. "The assessment is conducted by our senior threat specialist and our facility warhound, the Vreth." She said the name like it meant something. Class 9 designation. Certified apex hunter. He has assessed 41 non-cavalry animals in the past standard year. 41 classifications. All completed in under 2 hours. Hob yawned. It was a long yawn, the kind that involved his whole face and a sound like a slowly deflating tire, and it ended with him laying his chin on my foot. The intake officer made a note. The cavalry orientation facility was a large, low-ceiling complex built for efficiency rather than comfort. Everything was the same pale grey-green, including the lighting. The mess corridor ran the length of the main building, and the intake halls fed off it like tributaries. My civilian affiliate quarters were at the east end, near the loading bays, which meant Hob and I walked the full length of the mess corridor 3 times a day. He walked slowly. He always had. People who'd never met a lab before tended to assume slowness in a dog that size meant the animal was ill, or stupid, or both. It meant neither. Hob was deliberate. He smelled everything within range before he moved past it, and when he found a spot of floor he found acceptable, he lay down on it and that was that. On the first morning, he found a spot approximately in the center of the mess corridor, in the highest traffic section, and lay down with his chin on his paws and his eyes moving slowly across the room. I sat at the nearest table with my coffee and my orientation packet and let him do it. The cavalry cadets moved around him. Not because anyone told them to. They just moved around him, like water around a stone. I didn't think much of it at the time. The threat assessment appointment was scheduled for the afternoon of day 2. I want to be clear about something, because it matters for what came later. I did not go to the cavalry orientation facility expecting anything to happen. I was there because my employer, an agricultural equipment consortium on the cavalry's outer transit corridor, required civilian affiliates to complete a 40-hour orientation before issuing a transit tier visa. Hob was there because Hob went everywhere I went. He was a working animal in the technical sense, registered emotional support, all the paperwork, a vest he was largely indifferent to, but the honest version is that I'd had him since he was 8 weeks old and I didn't like being away from him. That's the whole story. The threat assessment wing was in the facility's northwest corner. The intake officer, a different one, younger, with a set of auxiliary eye clusters that kept orienting toward Hob, led us down a corridor that smelled of something astringent and faintly metallic. There were marks on the wall at intervals. Scoring, I realized after a moment. Deep parallel lines. Whatever lived in this wing had opinions about the walls. The Vreth was in a holding bay behind a set of reinforced panels. The intake officer explained, with obvious pride, that it massed 230 kilograms, had a threat classification ceiling of Class 9, and had never failed to produce an assessment in under 90 minutes. It had a head like a battering ram and legs that bent the wrong direction and a coat like wire bristle. It was watching us through the panel with eyes the color of old copper. It looked at me. It looked at Hob. Hob looked back at it with his half-lidded amber eyes, the same way he looked at the intake officer, the same way he looked at the corridor ceiling, the same way he looked at basically everything that wasn't a treat bag. Unhurried. Unimpressed. Already somewhere in his mind past this moment and on to the next warm floor. The Vreth sat down. The intake officer made a note. The assessment took 6 hours. I know because I sat in a waiting area outside the northwest wing for 6 hours, doing my orientation reading and sharing pieces of a protein bar with Hob, who accepted them with the solemn gravity he brought to all food transactions. Periodically someone in a different uniform would come out, look at Hob, make a note, and go back in. At the end of 6 hours, the senior threat specialist came out in person. He was tall for a Calvary, with the kind of careful, controlled stillness that either means someone is very calm or is working very hard to appear that way. "Your animal," he said. "Hob," I said. "He has not moved." Hob was lying on his side at this point, legs extended, breathing with the long, slow rhythm of an animal that has decided the floor is acceptable and has no further opinions about the situation. "He does that," I said. The specialist made a note. "The Vreth has refused to re-enter the assessment corridor. This has not previously occurred." "Hob walked through that corridor on the way in," I said. "Yes." A pause. "We are aware." He looked at Hob for a long moment. Hob's ear twitched once, the way it did when he was tracking a sound too faint for me to hear, and then went still again. "We will need additional time," the specialist said. "I've got nowhere to be," I said. Day 3, Hob's spot in the mess corridor had developed a perimeter. Not a formal one, nobody had put up barriers or markers, but the cavalry cadets and staff had, apparently without coordinating it, established a clear radius around the spot where Hob chose to lie and were routing themselves around it. When I asked one of the junior cadets about it, she looked at the floor and said that it seemed like the right thing to do. Hob spent most of day 3 asleep in that spot. Occasionally he'd lift his head, track something across the room with his eyes, and put his head back down. Twice he sighed the long, settling sigh of an animal completely at ease in its environment. The second time he did it, 2 cavalry cadets at a nearby table went very still. I kept doing my orientation reading. Day 3 was also when I started noticing the observation. Not Hob being observed. I'd expected that after the assessment wing business, but the quality of it. The specialists watching him weren't watching the way you watch something unfamiliar or something potentially dangerous in the conventional sense. They were watching the way you watch something that has already made a decision about you and you're still working out what the decision was. Hob had not growled. Hob had not stiffened. Hob had not done anything you could point to and say, "There, that's the moment." He'd walked into the facility on a leash, chosen a spot on the floor, and lain down on it. That was the full extent of his program. The report, I found out later, described his behavior as passive apex deer environmental assertion. The committee that reviewed it removed that phrase and replaced it with undetermined. The committee that reviewed that committee's work put passive apex deer environmental assertion back in. The final classification was something in cavalry bureaucratic language that my visa translator rendered, somewhat unhelpfully, as the animal that already decided. Day 4, the formal threat assessment team arrived. There were 5 of them, in the grey and copper uniforms of the Compact's Interspecies Risk Office. They set up observation equipment along the mess corridor wall, 3 units that looked like Compact sensors on articulated stands, and they waited. I got my breakfast. Hob walked to his spot and lay down. One of the assessment team moved a sensor 2 meters to the left to maintain line of sight. Hob yawned. It was the same yawn as day 1, the whole face yawn, the slow deflating tire sound, except that this time 5 certified threat specialists were watching it with the focused attention of people witnessing something they will be writing reports about for the remainder of their careers. He put his chin on his paws and closed his eyes. The team lead made a note. In the 90 minutes that followed, Hob slept, shifted to his side, accepted half a bread roll from me, sneezed once, and went back to sleep. The assessment team observed, conferred in low voices, observed some more, and filed. I finished my orientation reading. A junior cadet brought me a second coffee without being asked, which I thought was kind, and then I realized she was using the errand as an excuse to stand close to Hob for a few minutes, which I thought was also kind in its own way. The Vreth, according to what I heard secondhand that afternoon, had been quietly moved to the facility's south wing, on the far side of the complex from the mess corridor. The official communication described this as a protocol adjustment for operational optimization. It used 7 more paragraphs to say nothing further. The reclassification notice reached my intake file at 4 in the afternoon of day 4, which was also when I was notified that my visa processing had been delayed pending review of the reclassification. I want to be honest, that was irritating. I'd come here to complete 40 hours of orientation and get a transit visa, and instead I was sitting in a waiting area outside the risk office while 5 specialists reviewed footage of my dog sleeping. The team lead came out at 6 and apologized for the delay in the careful, Formal way of someone who doesn't entirely understand why the apology is necessary but has been advised by their supervisors that it is. The reclassification is not a restriction, he said. It does not affect your visa outcome. Good, I said. It affects his file. His intake classification has been updated. From comfort animal. Yes. To what? He said something in Calvary that my translator took a moment with. The first pass was Apex Companion, unverified behavioral ceiling. The second pass, which he said was more accurate, was Companion Animal, class undetermined, do not attempt to establish hierarchy. I looked at Hob. Hob was lying on my foot, which he'd been doing since I sat down in the waiting area, and his eyes were closed, and his breathing was the slow rhythmic breathing of an animal that is either deeply asleep or has simply decided that the current environment requires no further input from him. He's 11 years old, I said. He mostly wants to find a warm floor and lie on it. Yes, the team lead said. He looked at Hob for a moment with the expression I'd been seeing on Calvary faces for 4 days, the one that was still working out what the decision was. We are aware. The visa came through the next morning. The delay hadn't cost me anything. Hob and I were on the transit shuttle by noon, and he slept the whole way, which he always did, because the shuttle floor was flat and warm and he had no objections to it. The VREF, from what I understand, never returned to the mess corridor wing. The formal protocol adjustment stood. Hob never knew about any of it. Or if he did, he'd already decided it wasn't worth getting up for.